Lieutenant Marcus Raylan crouched low behind the shattered remains of a Karen transport ship, scanning the war-torn landscape of Kelevra Vivi. The planet's once beautiful surface was now a barren wasteland, its moon caught in a deadly conflict between two species, humanity and the Karen. The sky was a dull gray, filled with the scent of burned metal and distant explosions. Only the occasional blast of enemy fire broke the eerie silence that followed the retreating forces. The mission was simple: find any survivors from the battle that had raged across the planet and offer assistance. The Karen had started the war after a faction of their people had betrayed their own, turning to violence rather than diplomacy. Marcus had heard the rumors, whispers about Karen traitors, rogue groups that rejected the peace his people tried to offer. But Marcus was a soldier. He didn't care for politics. He was trained to help, to save lives, even if those lives belonged to the enemy. He moved swiftly, keeping low, and double-checked his ammo count. His eyes darted between the scattered wreckage and the occasional plume of smoke rising from the ground. His heart raced in the stillness. Every corner, every shadow could hide a threat. Then suddenly, a faint groan reached his ears, a cry for help. Marcus froze, his senses alert. It came from a pile of twisted metal nearby, half buried under debris. The sound was weak, barely audible over the distant rumble of the ongoing battle. His instincts kicked in. Someone was out there, hurt, maybe even a Karen. He didn't hesitate. Marcus ran toward the sound, ducking and weaving through the ruins. As he got closer, he could see the outline of a figure, slumped, broken. Blood stained the ground beneath it. Marcus's breath caught in his throat as he reached the figure. It was a Karen woman. Her skin, a deep shade of violet blue, was mottled with cuts and bruises. Her long, delicate limbs were twisted at unnatural angles, and she was barely conscious, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. She wasn't moving much, only her eyes flickering open, then shutting again. The Karen species were not known for their fragility. In fact, they were known to be resilient. But this woman's condition was severe. Marcus crouched beside her, feeling for a pulse, and let out a sigh of relief when he found it, faint but steady. "Hey," Marcus said softly, his voice low but firm. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes blinked slowly as she struggled to focus on him. Her breathing was labored, and she coughed weakly, blood staining her lips. She tried to speak, but only rasping sounds came out. "Don't try to talk," Marcus urged, his voice filled with concern. "I'm going to get you out of here." He glanced around, assessing the situation. It wasn't safe to stay in one place for too long. There could be enemy patrols nearby. But the woman, this alien, was in no condition to move. There was no time to wait for backup. The woman's dark eyes seemed to study him, and though she couldn't speak, her expression showed she understood his words. Slowly, she raised one hand, trembling, and pointed weakly at her chest. "I know," Marcus said softly. "You're hurt badly. I can help, but we need to act fast." He pulled out his medical kit, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. As a soldier, he had seen injuries far worse than this, but nothing like the kind he was dealing with now. The woman's veins were darkening, a sign of serious internal damage. His mind raced as he considered his options. A field transfusion could save her, but there were risks. Could a Karen's body accept human blood? The answer was clear when he saw her eyes plead for help. She wasn't going to survive unless he acted. With no time to waste, Marcus made a decision. He carefully connected his own medical pack to the transfusion system, then set it up to take blood from his own body. He took a deep breath, bracing himself. The woman's body needed what he had. He was her only chance. As the needle found its way into his arm, he winced slightly but remained focused. He wasn't sure how her body would react to human blood, but he had little choice. Slowly, he watched as her body began to respond. Her breathing steadied, and her chest no longer rose in sharp, desperate gasps. The color seemed to return to her face, and her dark eyes fluttered open. For a moment, Marcus held his breath. Was it enough? Her gaze met his, filled with confusion and disbelief. The caring woman seemed to understand the gravity of what had just happened, but she could barely move. Her body was still fragile. Marcus smiled faintly, even though his own strength was waning from the blood loss. "You're going to make it," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if it was true. But the woman's eyes softened, a look of silent gratitude in them. She raised a shaky hand toward him as if to say something, but her voice failed her. Instead, her hand landed gently on his, a quiet gesture of thanks. Marcus didn't have time to wonder what it all meant. He could only hope that his decision would be enough to save her life. The war still raged around them, and there was no telling what the next moment would bring. The sun had started to dip below the horizon, casting an orange glow across the war-torn landscape of HFY. The air was thick with dust, and the distant echoes of gunfire still rang out, even though the battle had mostly died down. Marcus Raylan stood over the injured Karen woman, his heart pounding in his chest. She was breathing steadily now, thanks to the blood he had given her, but he knew her survival wasn't guaranteed. Marcus felt the weight of the decision he had just made. In his years as a soldier, he had never once crossed the line between duty and compassion in such a way. Giving his blood to save an enemy, an alien, was dangerous. He had no idea how the woman's body would react to the transfusion. Karen physiology wasn't like human physiology. But in the moment, he had acted on instinct. He had seen a life hanging in the balance, and he had made a choice to help. The woman's eyes fluttered open again, and this time, her gaze seemed more focused. She wasn't entirely conscious, but she was aware enough to know what had happened. Her hand twitched slightly, and Marcus felt her fingers brush against his arm. The contact was light, but it was enough to show that she was trying to express something, perhaps gratitude, or maybe confusion. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked softly, kneeling beside her. She blinked at him, her eyes narrowing in concentration. She tried to speak, but only a weak rasp escaped her throat. Marcus could tell that speaking was too difficult for her. She was still weak, barely holding on. The soldier paused, thinking. There was no way he could move her far in her condition, and there was no guarantee he could carry her back to safety without attracting more attention. But he couldn't leave her here, not when he had already done so much to keep her alive. He scanned the area, looking for any signs of danger. The wreckage from the battle was scattered around them like a graveyard, with pieces of broken ships and debris scattered in every direction. The distant sound of combat still echoed in the background, but there was no immediate threat. For now, they were safe. Marcus gently adjusted the Karen woman's position, making sure she was comfortable despite her injuries. Her breathing was slow but steady. The blood transfusion had stabilized her, at least for the time being. But the real question was how long it would last. She might need more blood, and he didn't have any more to give. "I need to get you somewhere safe," Marcus said, talking to her as though she could understand every word. He had no idea if she could even speak his language, but something in her eyes told him she understood him, at least on some level. He surveyed the area once more. He had no idea where her people were, or even if they were still nearby. The Karen were known for their advanced technology and their mysterious ways, but Marcus had never dealt with them closely before. His interactions with them had always been limited to diplomatic meetings or distant negotiations. He had never thought he would be on the front lines, helping an injured alien with his own blood. But now, here he was, alone with a wounded Karen woman, caught between the shattered remains of a war and the uncertainty of what the future might hold. Marcus sighed, knowing that he couldn't leave her behind. He had to keep going, even if it meant risking his own life. He wasn't sure why he felt so compelled to help her. Maybe it was the look in her eyes, the way she had trusted him when no one else would. Maybe it was because, deep down, he still believed in something greater than the violence of war. There had to be more to life than fighting, more to peace than the destruction they had all witnessed. The woman shifted slightly, her gaze focusing on him again. She opened her mouth, and this time, her voice was faint but clear enough for Marcus to understand. "Why?" Her voice was barely a whisper, and Marcus had to lean in closer to hear her. "Why what?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "Why?" "Help," she managed, her voice full of confusion. Marcus hesitated. He wasn't sure how to explain it to her. He wasn't sure how to explain to an alien, to someone who might view him as an enemy, why he had chosen to risk his life for hers. He wasn't sure how to explain why, in the moment, he hadn't seen her as a Kirin or a soldier, but as a person in need. "I don't know," Marcus said honestly, his voice softer now. "I guess I just couldn't leave you to die. You're a person, just like me. Everyone deserves a chance to live." The woman seemed to process his words, her brow furrowing as she tried to make sense of them. Then, after a long pause, her lips parted in a faint smile. It wasn't much, just the smallest curve of her lips, but it was enough for Marcus to see that she understood. She didn't look at him with suspicion, but with something else, something more like gratitude, or maybe respect. "You are," she paused, struggling to find the right words. "Different." Marcus didn't know what she meant by that, but he knew one thing for sure. The moment they shared, even in silence, was a turning point. It was a moment that changed everything. Just as he was about to say something else, a soft sound reached his ears, the faint hum of a ship's engines. Marcus froze. Had it been a patrol from either side? Was it someone coming to finish what the battlefield had started? He quickly looked back at the woman, and she seemed to sense the same thing. Her eyes widened, her body tense. The ship was close now, and there was no time to waste. The hum of the ship grew louder, and Marcus's heart raced. He quickly looked around, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. Was it a Kirin ship, or was it a human patrol? He couldn't risk taking chances. The last thing he needed was to be caught in a crossfire, especially with the wounded woman beside him. The woman, Alarin, raised her head slightly, her eyes scanning the horizon. She, too, must have heard the distant noise. Marcus could see the tension in her face. Despite her injuries, she was still alert, focused. She looked at him, silently asking for answers. "Stay quiet," Marcus whispered, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "Let me check." He stood up carefully, taking one last look at Alarin before moving toward the edge of the wreckage. The ship's noise had grown even closer, and Marcus could now see its shape rising from behind the remains of a broken building. The silhouette of a Kirin vessel, sleek and smooth, almost like a silver streak against the darkening sky. Marcus's stomach twisted. This was no ordinary Kirin ship. The markings on it were too clean, too precise. It was a military ship, and it was heading straight toward them. His first instinct was to run, to get away as quickly as possible. But he couldn't leave Alarin behind. She needed him. She had no chance of escaping on her own. And even though she was Kirin, an enemy soldier in the eyes of many, Marcus felt a strange sense of responsibility toward her. He had already given his blood to save her life. It felt like they were tied together now, their fates inextricably linked. He turned to Alarin, his face set in determination. "I need you to trust me," he said, his voice low but firm. "We can't let them find us. We have to hide." Alarin nodded, her expression softening as she understood. She tried to sit up, wincing in pain, but Marcus quickly moved to help her. He supported her with one arm, his grip firm but gentle. Her skin was still cool to the touch, though the blood transfusion had made a difference. She was stronger than before, but she still had a long way to go. With careful steps, Marcus led Alarin toward a small crevice between two large chunks of debris. It wasn't much, but it was the best hiding place he could find. They crouched low, trying to remain out of sight. Marcus's pulse hammered in his ears as he kept his gaze fixed on the approaching ship. As the Kirin vessel drew closer, Marcus could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He wasn't sure what would happen once they were found. Would they kill him for helping an enemy? Would they take Alarin as a prisoner, or worse? His thoughts were interrupted by Alarin's soft voice, barely a whisper. "You don't have to do this," she said, her words heavy with meaning. "I'm not worth your life." Marcus shook his head, his eyes still fixed on the approaching ship. "You are worth it," he replied quietly. "I couldn't just leave you to die. I couldn't." Alarin fell silent, her eyes wide with surprise. It was clear that her people, the Kirin, didn't see humans the way Marcus saw them. To her, humans were the enemy. But somehow the bond between them was starting to form, born not of war, but of shared experience, a shared need to survive. The Kirin ship slowed as it neared their position, hovering above the ground. The sound of its engines was deafening now, and Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. Every instinct told him to run, but there was nowhere to go. They were trapped. The ship's hatch opened, and figures in armored suits began to descend. Marcus's eyes scanned the area, looking for any sign of help, but there was nothing. It was just him and Alarin, caught in the middle of a war they didn't choose. Then, just as he thought they were about to be discovered, a voice rang out from behind them. "Hold your fire." The voice was clear, commanding, and unmistakable. It was a Kirin voice, but it was different from the soldiers' harsh tones. It was calm, almost compassionate. "They are not enemies." Marcus turned sharply, his breath catching in his throat. From the shadows of the wreckage emerged another Kirin, this one with bright green markings on her face, signifying a higher rank. She moved toward them with an air of authority, her gaze locked on Alarin. "Alarin Devra," the woman said, her voice filled with recognition. "You're alive." Alarin, still weak but no longer trembling with fear, looked up at the Kirin officer. There was a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "Captain Lyrell," Alarin whispered, her voice hoarse but filled with relief. Lyrell nodded, her expression softening. She turned to Marcus, her gaze calculating. "You helped her," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "You saved her life." Marcus hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say. He wasn't sure whether this was a trap, or if the Kirin officer was simply honoring Alarin's request. But before he could respond, Lyrell spoke again. "You've done more than most," she said. "You've earned a debt, one that we will repay." Alarin's eyes met Marcus's, and in that moment, they both understood. Whatever had happened in the past, whatever the future held, this moment had forged something new. A connection between two people, two beings who were no longer enemies, but allies in the truest sense of the word. Captain Lyrell's gaze softened as she studied Marcus, and for the first time since he had landed on Kelevra VI, he felt something other than the weight of war pressing down on him. There was no anger in her eyes, no suspicion, only a quiet understanding. "You've done more than I thought possible, human," Lyrell said, her voice calm and measured. "You saved Alarin, despite everything. It's rare to see such compassion in a time like this." Marcus didn't know how to respond. The words were simple, but they held a depth of meaning that he wasn't sure he could grasp. A Kirin officer, someone who had fought against his people, was thanking him. "Thank you for helping her," Lyrell continued. "But this is not over. You've put yourself in danger, and I cannot simply let that go without ensuring your safety." Marcus's mind raced. He didn't trust the Kirin completely. How could he? They had been at war for years. Yet here he was, standing in front of one of their commanders, who seemed to be offering something different, an unexpected lifeline. Alarin, still weak but more alert than she had been earlier, looked between the two of them. Her gaze lingered on Marcus. "You shouldn't have risked your life for me," she said softly, her voice hoarse. "I am no ally to you. I am Kirin." Marcus gave a small, reassuring smile, though he felt the weight of her words. "We've all got our roles to play," he said, his voice steady. "I couldn't just leave you to die. Whether you're Kirin or not, You needed help. Alarin's eyes softened, and for the first time, she seemed to believe him. She nodded slightly, then turned her gaze back to Lyrel. The caring captain let out a small sigh and gestured to Marcus. "It seems you've earned your place here," she said, her voice a mixture of resignation and curiosity. "But we must move quickly. This area is not safe. We'll take you with us, but you'll need to come with me to the command post. There are things we need to discuss." Marcus hesitated. He had no way of knowing what would happen once they arrived at the Karen command post. Would they arrest him for aiding the enemy, or would they truly honor the debt they seemed to be offering? But he knew he had little choice. They had offered him safety, and if he stayed behind, he and Alarin would both be vulnerable. "All right," Marcus agreed, standing up. "I'll go with you." Alarin struggled to stand on her own, but quickly accepted Marcus's support. She could walk, but barely. The transfusion had kept her alive, but she was still weak from her injuries. Lyrel motioned to a small group of Karen soldiers who had been waiting nearby, watching the exchange silently. They had been prepared for trouble, but seeing their captain's reaction to Marcus's actions had clearly taken them by surprise. They adjusted their weapons, keeping a wary distance but not making any move toward confrontation. "We'll move out in pairs," Lyrel instructed. "Stay close, and do not make any sudden movements. We don't know if this area is clear." With a final glance at Marcus and Alarin, Lyrel began to lead the way, her soldiers following closely behind her. Marcus felt a strange mix of anxiety and hope. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but he knew one thing. He couldn't turn back now. As they moved through the wreckage, Marcus kept his senses alert. The Karen soldiers were trained and disciplined, their movements synchronized as they navigated the ruins of the battlefield. He tried to make himself as small a target as possible, staying close to Alarin while keeping an eye on their surroundings. He had no illusions about the danger they were in. They were walking through the aftermath of a war, his war. "Stay close," Lyrel called back to him, her voice cool but authoritative. "If anyone questions your presence, I'll handle it." Marcus nodded, grateful for her protection, but still unsure of what lay ahead. The tension in the air was palpable. Every corner they turned, every shadow they passed, seemed to hold the potential for an ambush. Marcus had been trained to expect the worst at all times, and though this wasn't his battlefield, his instincts told him to be ready. Alarin leaned against him as they walked, her breathing steady but still labored. She looked up at him once, her dark eyes filled with gratitude. There was a silent understanding between them now, a connection that went beyond the war that had brought them together. She had been his enemy, but now she was something else. She was a person, and he had saved her life, even if he wasn't sure why. "What will happen now?" Marcus asked quietly, not sure if he was speaking to Alarin or to himself. Alarin's voice was soft, barely more than a whisper. "You've earned their respect, but the war doesn't stop just because of one life saved. You must know that." Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. "I know," he said quietly, "but I have to believe that it's worth something, that we can make a difference." They walked for what felt like hours, the shadows growing longer as the day turned to night. The Karen soldiers led them through the ruins, finally arriving at a hidden command center. The structure was well concealed, a small fort built into the side of a rocky hill. It was fortified, guarded by more soldiers and advanced security systems. As they approached, Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He was entering a place where he had no idea what his future held. Lyrel turned to face him as they reached the entrance. "Welcome to the command post. From here, you will be safe, for now." Marcus took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He wasn't sure what was coming next, but he knew one thing. His journey with Alarin had only just begun. The door to the command post slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a space that was starkly different from the chaos outside. Inside, the walls were lined with advanced technology, glowing panels flickering with maps and data. There were no signs of the damage that had scarred the outside world, and the air smelled fresh and sterile. But the tension in the room was palpable, a stark contrast to the calm surroundings. Marcus stepped inside, still unsure of what to expect. Alarin leaned on him for support, her body still weak from the injury she had sustained. The soft hum of machinery filled the silence as they were led deeper into the facility. Lyrell moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the room as if looking for something. The soldiers who had followed them into the command post spread out, standing at attention. Their discipline was undeniable, and Marcus couldn't help but feel a small sense of admiration for them, despite their past. "Sit here," Lyrell instructed, motioning to a chair in the center of the room. It was a simple, functional chair, but it looked like a throne compared to the cold ground Marcus had grown used to. Alarin hesitated for a moment, then lowered herself into the chair, wincing slightly as she did. Marcus sat beside her, glancing around at the technology surrounding them. The walls were covered in glowing screens, most of them showing the same type of maps that had been displayed earlier. But there was something different about them now, something that Marcus couldn't quite place. It wasn't just the Karen's military technology, it was the way it was being used. The screens weren't just showing military movements, they were showing data on the war's impact on both sides, the damage done to the planet, and the resources at risk. Lyrell's voice broke through his thoughts. "You've put us in a difficult position, human," she said, her tone even, though there was a flicker of something in her eyes. "You saved Alarin, and in doing so, you've gained my respect. But that respect comes with a price." Marcus turned to look at her, his heart skipping a beat. "What price?" "There are those among my people who will not accept this," Lyrell continued, her gaze flicking to the soldiers around them. "The war is not just about fighting. It's about survival. And survival often demands making difficult choices." Marcus frowned, his mind racing. He had expected challenges, but this wasn't just about personal safety. It was about everything. "You're saying there are others who will see this as a betrayal." "Exactly," Lyrell replied. "But you saved Alarin, and because of that, I believe you might be able to do more for us than anyone else could." Marcus wasn't sure if he believed her. He had heard plenty of talk about how things could change if only one side would make the first move. But actions spoke louder than words, and he wasn't about to blindly trust someone who had been his enemy only a short time ago. Alarin shifted in her seat, her voice weak but clear. "What does she mean, Marcus?" she asked, her gaze tired but focused on him. Lyrell's gaze softened slightly at the mention of Alarin's name. "You've seen the effects of this war," she said, turning toward Alarin. "Our planet is dying. It's not just from the fighting. It's from the toll it's taking on our resources. The war has drained us, and the longer it continues, the more we stand to lose. We need help. We need a way to survive this." Marcus processed her words, the weight of them sinking in. He had seen the destruction firsthand, the ruined cities, the dead soldiers, the endless suffering. He had seen the war's toll on his own people, but he hadn't realized just how bad it was on the Karen side as well. The planet's resources were running dry, and with the war still raging, there seemed to be no end in sight. "And you think I can help?" Marcus asked cautiously. Lyrell nodded, her expression serious. The war was never just about conquering territory or showing dominance. It was about survival. Both of our species are facing the same problem: how to keep going when there's nothing left. But if we can find a way to work together, to end this conflict, maybe we can save something of what's left. Alarin looked at Lyrell, her gaze skeptical. "You're asking him to trust us, after everything that's happened." "I'm asking him to trust the future," Lyrell replied softly. "And I'm asking you to do the same, Alarin. We can't keep fighting forever." There was a long silence as the weight of Lyrell's words sank in. Marcus thought about everything he had seen, the destruction, the suffering, and a flicker of something new began to grow in him. He had always believed in peace, in the idea that there had to be more to life than war, but the reality of it had always seemed out of reach. Now it didn't seem so far away. Not if both sides were willing to let go of the past. Marcus turned to Alarin, her eyes still full of doubt. "We don't have to keep fighting, you know," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Maybe there's another way." She didn't answer at first. Instead, she looked at the floor, deep in thought. Then, finally, she raised her eyes to meet his. "Maybe," she said softly. "Maybe there's a chance." Lyrell watched the exchange with quiet approval. She didn't push them. She knew that this was something only Marcus and Alarin could decide. She had put the idea in their minds, but it was up to them to take the next step. "Take your time," Lyrell said. "The decision is yours. But know this, we're not the only ones suffering. We're not the only ones looking for a way out." Marcus looked at Alarin one last time, a sense of hope growing inside him. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't alone. The room fell into silence after Lyrell's words. The weight of the decision that lay before Marcus and Alarin seemed to fill the air, heavy and almost suffocating. There were no easy answers, no clear path forward. Yet, despite the uncertainty, Marcus felt a sense of resolve building within him. He had always believed that there had to be a better way, a way to end the violence and pain, to find peace even in the darkest moments. But the war had made that belief feel impossible. Now, sitting here in this strange, uncertain place, he felt a flicker of hope. The possibility of peace wasn't so distant anymore. But what did it really mean to trust the Kirin? Could he truly believe that they wanted peace, or was this just another manipulation, a clever way to buy time while they regrouped and strengthened their forces? Alarin shifted uncomfortably in her seat, breaking Marcus's thoughts. She seemed exhausted, her body still recovering from the injuries she had sustained. But there was something else in her eyes, something Marcus couldn't quite place. Was it doubt? Fear? Or maybe it was something else entirely. "You don't have to do this, Marcus," Alarin said quietly, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "You've helped me, and that's more than anyone could ask for. But this is bigger than just us. You're asking me to trust the very people who've been fighting against your kind. You're asking me to trust the enemy." Marcus turned to her, his eyes searching hers for the words that would convince her. But deep down, he knew that it wasn't just about words. It was about what they were willing to believe, what they were willing to fight for. "I'm not asking you to trust them, Alarin," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. "I'm asking you to trust me. And I'm asking you to trust that we don't have to keep fighting. The way things are going, no one is going to win. Everyone is just losing." Alarin's gaze softened, but there was still a trace of uncertainty in her eyes. She had been trained to fight, to survive by any means necessary. Her entire life had been shaped by the war, and now, for the first time, she was being asked to consider something different. "I don't know if I can do that," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if I can trust them. Or you." Marcus reached out, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I understand," he said softly. "It's not easy, but sometimes the hardest thing is the right thing. We can choose to keep fighting, or we can try to end this. We can try to make things better." Lyrell, who had been watching the exchange quietly, stepped forward. "You both have your doubts, and that's understandable. But I can tell you this, the Kirin leadership is not the same as it once was. We have been forced to confront the truth that we are losing the war, losing our people, and losing our planet." Marcus turned his attention to Lyrell, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Lyrell's eyes darkened as she spoke. "The Kirin have been on the brink of collapse for some time now. Our resources are running low, and we're facing more threats than just the humans. There are other factions out there, ruthless, dangerous groups that have no interest in peace, only in power. If we don't find a way to end this war soon, we may not have a chance to survive at all." The truth of her words hung in the air, thick and undeniable. Marcus felt a sinking feeling in his chest. This wasn't just about the war between humans and Kirin. It was about the survival of both species. Alarin's gaze shifted from Lyrel back to Marcus, and for the first time since they had met, Marcus saw something new in her eyes. It wasn't just doubt anymore. It was a spark, a flicker of something that resembled hope. "If we try," Alarin said slowly, her voice filled with a mixture of caution and curiosity. "What happens next? What do we do?" Marcus gave a small, hopeful smile. "We take it one step at a time. We start by talking, by seeing if there's any way to break the cycle of violence. If it works, maybe we can work together to rebuild. Maybe we can fix things." Lyrel's eyes softened as she watched the exchange. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult. There would be many obstacles, many enemies who would never agree to peace. But there was a chance, a real chance, that they could change things. And that was enough to give her hope. "I'll arrange a meeting with the Kirin leadership," Lyrel said, her voice firm, but laced with determination. "It will not be easy. But if we can convince them to hear us, to understand that we cannot continue like this, maybe we can change the future." Marcus nodded, his resolve growing stronger. "Then we'll do it. We'll make them listen." The Kirin captain studied him for a moment, as though weighing his sincerity. Finally, she nodded. "I believe you, human, and I believe that we have a chance, if only we're brave enough to take it." Alarin remained quiet for a moment before speaking again. "I'm still not sure," she admitted, her voice hesitant. "But I'll try. For you. For the future." Marcus smiled at her, feeling a warmth spread through him. It wasn't much, just a small step. But it was something. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt like he might be on the right path. Together, with Lyrel's help, they had the chance to make a difference. It wasn't the end of the war. Not yet. But it was the beginning of something new, something that might just change everything. The days that followed were filled with tension. Marcus, Alarin, and Lyrel worked together, preparing for the meeting with the Kirin leadership. They all knew how important this moment was. The stakes were higher than ever. One wrong move, one mistake, could shatter everything. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty that hung in the air. Despite the hope that had begun to grow within him, he was still deeply aware of how fragile their situation was. It wasn't just about peace. It was about survival for both sides. If the leadership didn't listen, if they rejected the idea of ending the war, everything they had worked for would be lost. He found himself pacing the small room they had been given in the command post, his mind racing with thoughts of what might come next. Alarin sat quietly on a chair nearby, still recovering from her injuries, her face a mixture of exhaustion and quiet determination. She hadn't spoken much since their conversation, but Marcus could see the change in her. There was still doubt, still fear, but there was something else now too. A flicker of belief that maybe, just maybe, peace wasn't impossible. Lyrel entered the room, her presence commanding but not unkind. "It's time," she said, her voice steady. Marcus turned to face her, his heart beating faster. "Are they ready to listen?" Lyrel gave a small nod. "They're ready. Whether they're willing to act on what we say, though, remains to be seen." Alarin stood up slowly, her expression unreadable. "I'm not sure what to expect, but I'll be there." Marcus nodded, feeling a sense of solidarity between them. "We'll do this together." The three of them left the command post and made their way to a larger room deep within the facility. As they entered, Marcus felt the weight of the moment settle over him. The room was filled with Kirin officers, all wearing the same cold, stoic expressions that Marcus had grown so familiar with. At the far end of the room stood the Kirin leaders, the ones who had made the decisions that had kept the war going for so long. The room fell silent as they entered. Lyrel took her place at the front, while Marcus and Alarin stood beside her. The leaders didn't speak right away, their eyes scanning Marcus and Alarin, sizing them up as if they were nothing more than pawns in a game of strategy. Finally, A tall Kirin officer, his voice deep and commanding, spoke. "You've brought us a human and one of our enemies. What is the meaning of this, Captain Lyrell?" Lyrell stood tall, her voice calm but filled with authority. "We are here to discuss the future. The war has cost us all too much. If we continue, we will have nothing left. No people, no resources, no future. I believe it is time for us to consider a new path." The officer's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. He was waiting for more. Lyrell continued, "This human, Marcus, saved Ellerin's life. He didn't do it because of his loyalty to us or to any side. He did it because he believes there is more to life than fighting, and he's not alone. Many of our soldiers, many of your people, feel the same way." Marcus stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment where everything could change. "I don't want to fight anymore," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I don't want to keep killing for a cause that doesn't make sense. The war has gone on long enough. We all deserve something better." The room was still for a moment, and Marcus could feel the tension in the air. The Carrion leaders exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. But then, slowly, the tall officer spoke again. "You ask for peace, but peace cannot come without a price. Both sides have lost much. Do you truly believe we can walk away from this war? That we can trust each other after everything that has happened?" Marcus met his gaze without hesitation. "I don't know if we can trust each other, but I do know this. If we don't try, if we don't make an effort to find a way forward, we'll never have a future. We'll just keep fighting until there's nothing left of us." The officer looked at him for a long moment, his face hard and calculating. For a brief second, Marcus wondered if he had said the wrong thing. But then, something shifted. The officer's shoulders seemed to relax, and he finally spoke again, his voice quieter, but no less firm. "You speak of trust, human. You speak of peace. But peace is not something that can be given easily. It is something that must be built, step by step. And if we are to have any chance at peace, we will need the cooperation of both sides." Marcus nodded. "I'm ready to work for that. I know it won't be easy, but I believe it's worth it." There was a long silence as the officers discussed among themselves, speaking in their own language. Marcus couldn't understand what they were saying, but he could see the shift in their body language. They were listening. They were considering it. Finally, the tall officer turned back to Marcus and Lyrell. "We will open negotiations," he said. "But make no mistake. This is a test. If either side falters, the war will resume. Do you understand?" Marcus took a deep breath and nodded. "I understand." As the meeting concluded and the Carrion leaders left the room, Marcus felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The first step had been taken, but it was only the first step. The road ahead would be long and difficult. But for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt like there was hope. Ellerin stepped up beside him, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but also with a sense of possibility. "You did it," she said quietly. "We did it." Marcus gave her a small smile. "We're not done yet, but this is a start." As they walked out of the room together, Marcus felt a sense of unity with Ellerin, with Lyrell, and with the possibility of a future where they could all live without war. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't guaranteed, but it was something worth fighting for. And for the first time, Marcus truly believed that peace was possible.